Many policies that raise a country's aggregate welfare may nonetheless be politically infeasible. Trade, for example, may raise total welfare but have unevenly distributed benefits. And while it is hypothetically possible for the winners to compensate the losers to make everyone better off, in practice such bargaining can break down in multiple ways. This paper studies another policy that is likely to have aggregate benefits: allowing refugees to work. As of 2023, more than 42 million people worldwide were refugees or asylum seekers, and over half lived in countries with significant government-imposed barriers to the labor market. These restrictions are generally motivated by concerns of crowding out native workers, and they lead to lost income, poor mental health, and skill atrophy among refugees. What if citizens of host countries were offered a different political economy bargain? Aid-sharing policies allow refugees to access a country's labor market, and because their ability to work makes them more self-reliant, some of the resulting foreign aid or public finance surplus can be redistributed to natives. Such policies have already been implemented in some countries, and this framework is outlined in the UN's 2018 Global Compact on Refugees. Nonetheless, it remains unclear whether redistributing aid actually increases support for refugee integration. To investigate, this paper's authors designed and offered several programs to native micro-entrepreneurs in Kampala, the capital city of Uganda. With over 1.6 million refugees, Uganda hosts the largest population of refugees in Africa and is a leading example of an aid-sharing bargain. Government policy stipulates that 30% of international refugee aid be shared with natives, and refugees are allowed to work and move freely. But awareness of this aid-sharing policy is low, so the author's first program focused on delivering information about the policy and its connection to refugee integration. The second program augmented this with a business grant of $135 and explained that the grant was an example of compensation for Ugandans under the policy bargain. Finally, because there is substantial evidence that attitudes about immigration are largely driven by cultural rather than economic opposition, a third program facilitated contact between Ugandans and refugees in the form of business mentorship pairings. Study participants were randomly assigned to programs, and by comparing outcomes against a control group that received no treatment, the authors track each program's impact on support for refugee integration. They find that receiving a grant labeled as aid from the refugee response substantially increases support for admitting refugees and for policies that facilitate integration. Recipients are 13 percentage points more likely to say they support Uganda's hosting of refugees generally, on a base of 75%, and grants increase support for admitting more refugees and extending the right to work and freedom of movement. A summary index of support for refugee integration increases by 0.36 standard deviations, and the effects persist for at least 2 years. Receiving information about the aid-sharing policy, but no grant, has similar but smaller effects, while direct contact with refugees has only minimal effects. This suggests that in this context, economic interventions are more effective than cultural ones. In fact, the results show that once participants' policy and economic views on refugee hosting shift, changes in cultural attitudes follow with a lag. To assess whether these changes in self-reported views translate into political behavior, a separate nonprofit contacted the study's participants 1 year after the interventions were complete to ask whether they would support a letter to local officials expressing approval for refugee hosting. Grant recipients were 10 percentage points more likely to support the letter, off a base of 23%, while there were no significant impacts of either the information-only or contact treatments. How generalizable are these findings? Relative to other countries, Ugandans exhibit relatively high support for refugees, and the paper's primary intervention coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic, which may have affected participants' perceptions of the grants. To address these concerns, in 2024, the authors conducted a second experiment in rural Kenya, where opposition to refugee integration is higher, there is no similar aid-sharing bargain, and refugees' labor market access is restricted. Grant recipients here were informed that they were receiving the grant because Kenya hosts refugees, and that future aid sharing could be increased with expanded labor market access for refugees. Even in this very different setting, grants had large effects on support for refugee integration. Overall, the findings from both experimental settings suggest there are three key mechanisms driving the change in policy views. First, the effectiveness of the information-only treatment indicates that simply learning about the aid-sharing policy can increase support for refugee integration. Directly supplying aid is even more effective as it renders the accompanying information more credible. Notably, the grants had no significant impact on business outcomes or household welfare, which suggests that participants' changing views cannot be attributed to a wealth effect. There is, however, evidence suggesting that grants reduce resource resentment. That is, they reduce negative views toward other groups who are perceived to be receiving unfair levels of aid. Thus, this paper provides experimental evidence that redistributing the aggregate gains from a policy, and, importantly, clearly communicating the elements of that policy bargain, can influence political views and build policy support. These findings speak to ongoing efforts to increase support for refugee integration, and may also apply to other contentious issues such as economic immigration and reducing barriers to trade. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. This includes papers on attitudes toward immigrants, refugees, and displaced people more broadly, the impacts of aid, and the effect of economic shocks on policy preferences.